Why don't you take a seat and tell me what appears to be the problem? Welcome to another exciting new episode of Consult the Doctor, where I try to answer pen questions in my characteristic, peculiar manner. It has been a while that I recorded one of these, so I thought it would be fun, and I got some interesting questions. I'm just looking down because I'm going to write down a timestamp for myself later. First question came through email and was about how do you remove a pelican nib and feed from the ring that retains it. So what's interesting about pelican nibs is that they screw out of the pens very easily, but they don't tend to have a traditional nib collar. So usually you have nib and feed, and surrounding that's a piece of plastic, sometimes ebonite, and that's called a nib collar. And that nib collar holds the two in place and usually has threads, and then you unscrew the nib unit. For some pens it works a little differently, but I would say 9 out of 10 times that's about how it works. Pelikan does things a little bit differently. They have their nib and feed, and around them is a metal retaining ring with threads. Now, the trick with those things is, I would say that usually there is absolutely no need to remove that ring, and I would not recommend removing that ring. But if you absolutely have to for some reason, I would recommend the use of a nib knockout block. Those are tools that are used by a lot of people who do a lot of nib work, and they work very well for vintage pens, because they typically have a section which just has a big hole in it, and a nib and feed are squeezed into that. Then there is a big opening at the end of that. A nib knockout block is just a block with holes in it of different diameters. You put the section on top of that block, and then with something like an awl. It's an awl, isn't it? No, I'm confusing my tools because I'm not a tool guy. Or some sort of, I think it's an awl, or like something like a punch, little rod, and a little hammer, tiny little hammer. You can knock out from behind. You can put that metal rod through that hole, knock it from behind, nib and feed will fall out. That can also be used, I have used that kind of stuff for those pelican nibs. Then you put that metal ring, you rest it on top of the hole, you knock that from behind, and then nib and feed come out. Now the problem is, this is not an arbitrary thing, because you have to also slide that ring back on. I would always make sure everything is wet just with water, because that lubricates a little bit. You can slide that ring back on, but you have to do that in exactly the right way, because if nib and feed stick out too far, so are not pushed in far enough, you screw it back in, you cap it, you can actually bend the nib because it's hitting the cap. You have to do your best for that a little bit to make it stick out that far, but I'm just saying theoretically that could happen. And you can get a gap between the nib and the feed if you don't align things properly and put that ring back on. So I would not recommend this, but if that's absolutely what you have to do, that's how I would do it. Okay, the next question, given that we're on a Pelikan roll, I thought was kind of an interesting one too, deals with, on your greatest of all time video, there were no Montblancs and Pelikans, but initially you did reviews of Montblancs and Pelikans and you were quite happy with them. So this paraphrase, that's about the gist of it. So, ¿qué pasa? Well, I cannot emphasize enough, I have nothing against Montblanc or Pelikan pens. I just don't own any, because they're not really my taste anymore. What I had, Montblanc, Pelikan, I have sold. Not because there was anything wrong with these pens, they're just not really my taste anymore. Tastes can change. They're nice writers. I love the way Pelikans tend to write. And M1000 nib is a great nib that I like using a lot. I just didn't have use for it anymore because I now have other pens that I like more. So I'm not dissing the brand. It's just not my thing. I mean, why do you like red and not green? I mean, it's something like that. It's just not really my thing. And yes, I think they're very nice pens. I have no issues with them. But that's really all. It's just not my pens. And some people, not the person who asked this question, but some people get extremely offended when I have lists that do not contain the pens that they like on them, but it's a personal list. And I know Greats of All Time is also not a great name because it's more of my personal favorites list. But once upon a time, it started as what I thought were the greatest pens ever made. And then I kind of stuck with that title. It's all personal. It's just fun. It's a review. It's a pen video. It's not meant to be anything beyond that. So don't worry if you like Montblanc or Pelikan. I have nothing against these brands. And even if I did, that wouldn't matter in any way. Because you like them. And that's what matters, right? Okay. Next questions deal with inks. And the first question I thought was a very good one. Came to me through email. Sorry it took me a while to get to. But what makes an ink wet? And is that something that manufacturers do on purpose? It's something they kind of control, I think, was the question. And how do you know if an ink is wet? Well, I'll start with that last question. You don't. You don't know whether an ink is wet. You can't tell from the bottle, I think. I really don't know how you would do that. So you have to try it out. And remember that dipping a pen in a store, if you live in an area where you have pen stores, dipping a pen is not very useful. Because you dip a pen, yes, you can write with it, but you're going to be dealing with a saturated feed, so you have a very wet writer. It's going to feel smoother than it is when it's filled the proper way, piston, converter, whatever you have. So I don't know how useful it is. But having said all this, what makes an ink wet? Well, my degree is not in chemistry, so I'm going to keep this really, really simple. What makes an ink wet is its viscosity. And viscosity, and if you do have a degree in chemistry, you probably want to slap me across the face, but I'm very simply, viscosity is created by the way molecules in a suspension or in a liquid react, like how they react to each other. I bet if you write that down on a test, it would be 1 out of 10 marks. But there we are. That is what makes an ink write wetter. Different levels of viscosity, different levels of wetness. And that's it. Now, some inks are known to be particularly wet. And then you want to know which ones. Well, for example, I found the Iroshizuku inks to be pretty wet, typically. B.R.E inks I found to be on the drier side. So they tend to be drier. L'Idée, beautiful ink made by B.R.E, very, very dry. Okay? So then there are products, Vaness sells some, for example, that you can add to an ink, but you can even use the tiniest bit of dishwashing detergent, and I'm talking microscopic amounts, not even a full drop. Add a tiny bit to ink, and it kind of acts like a surfactant, and it starts to write more wetly. So you can buy a product. You may already have a product. If you have some liquid dishwashing detergent in your house, you can already use that, right? That makes it wetter. Then there is lubrication. Some inks are lubricated, and Noodlers has this I don't know, I forget what they're called, slippery eel or something. They are lubricated. Likewise, you have Iroshizuku, which is a lubricated ink. That tends to make things a little bit wetter, and it's supposedly like sort of auto-greasing pistons or something, if I understood correctly. I'm not sure how valid all these claims are, but what I will say is inks with lubrication in it tend to be wetter. I have found them to be wetter. When I have a dry nib, I tend to put in an Iroshizuku ink, and I find it gets a little wetter. That means you don't have to fiddle with the nib, you don't have to send it to a nib master, you can make it a little wetter. Do not expect a night and day difference, because it will not be that, but it will be a little bit of difference, and that can be enough to make a noticeable difference, and it can turn a pen from a dry writer you don't like so much to something that writes pretty nicely. So that's kind of the deal. Again, B.R.E can be a little drier. Lamy, in my experience, can be a little drier. Waterman I found to be wetter, nicer. Parker Quink I found to be a little drier. Iroshizuku is wetter. Some of the Noodlers inks are very wet. Aurora Black I found to be on the wetter end of things. So you're going to have to experiment. I don't have an exhaustive list of these are wet and these are dry, so please don't ask me because I probably don't know. But there we are. I hope that makes that point clearer. Final question. this one was kind of related to that in my mind. You tended to use a lot of boutique inks, and now you don't anymore. I think I've told the stories often enough, so I'll be brief about it. I have had issues. I've had issues with Noodless inks. I've had issues with Private Reserve inks. That does not mean that I hate the brands. Make your own decision. It's a free world. I know that I will not put those inks in my pens again, especially after a Noodless ink liquefied latex parts in the pen. That ink did not come with a warning that it would do so, but it did. And then I had to get that pen repaired. So there we are, right? Does that mean that those depends on how you want to define boutique inks, but does that mean that non-boutique inks are perfect? No. For example, I love Montblanc inks. I have never had issues with Montblanc inks. One of my friends, also called Stephen, by the way, has, and he has told me a couple times that Montblanc inks have clogged his pens. I have not experienced that. And I say that in all honesty, I have no ties to Montblanc, as I've pointed out earlier. But different people have different experiences, different humidities, different pens, different types of feeds, different nib grades. All these kinds of things can affect that, the cleaning practices of pens. So I have found that there are certain brands that I like. I like Iroshizuku. I like Waterman. I like Diamine. I like Montblanc. I like some of the Leonardo inks. And I stick with those. Just because I know they work. And if I know they work for me, why change things up? And I know that for some people, ink is incredibly exciting, and getting new ink in the perfect red or the perfect blue. I don't have that. I have the colors I like. I know I like them, and I don't have the need to explore any further and find an ink that may not flow well or whatever. It's just not worth it to me. And that's fully personal, right? I know that for some people this is incredibly exciting to have 5,000 different inks. I'm not that person. I own a lot of ink, got rid of a lot of ink. I have what I like, and that's it. And that's not at all, I'm not at all saying that, I want to emphasize that I'm not saying any of these inks are bad. I know there are great Noodless inks. I had an issue with one particular Noodless ink. Other Noodless inks have reputations. The Bay State series stains a lot, but some people love that and love the intensity of those colors. I'm not here to say this is good and this is bad. I am here to say why I made specific choices, and that's why. And you do whatever you want, and that's perfectly fine. So, I hope this was useful. If you have any other questions, leave them below. I'll try to get to them. And that's all there's to it. Do whatever you want to do. Bye.